The supercomputer thought experiment rests on a reductionist assumption that perception and knowledge can be reduced to the processing of sensory information inside the brain. It assumes that if a sufficiently advanced computer were provided with exactly the same sensory inputs as a human brain, it could reproduce the same knowledge and conscious experience. I believe this assumption is fundamentally mistaken. Knowledge does not literally exist inside the brain, nor is perception something the brain performs in isolation. Knowledge emerges from the ongoing relationship between an organism and its environment. What an organism comes to know depends upon how it is able to act within its surroundings and what possibilities for action those surroundings provide. James J. Gibson referred to these possibilities as affordances. An affordance is not simply a property of an object, nor is it merely an internal mental representation. It is a relationship between an organism and its environment. A branch affords perching to a bird but not to a human. A staircase affords climbing to an adult but not necessarily to an infant. The environment, therefore, contains different information depending upon the body, scale, capabilities, and needs of the organism encountering it. An organism perceives the world relative to its own size, scale, bodily structure, sensory systems, and biological requirements. These factors jointly determine which affordances become available. Perception is therefore relational rather than computational. The ecological approach to perception, developed principally by James J. Gibson, departs fundamentally from computational theories of perception. Although the theory is extensive, its implications for the supercomputer thought experiment can be summarized in 4 central arguments. 1. The brain does not perceive. The organism does. Ecological psychology does not deny the importance of the brain. Rather, it rejects the claim that perception occurs exclusively inside it. Perception belongs to the organism as a whole. An organism must move, explore, manipulate, and navigate its environment in order to perceive it. Every act of perception occurs from a particular bodily perspective defined by the organism's size, sensory organs, capabilities, and biological goals. For example, it makes little sense to say that a brain perceives the possibility of walking towards a tree independently of a body capable of walking. The affordance of walkability depends upon an organism possessing legs and existing within an environment where walking is possible. At the same time, this does not diminish the role of the brain. Without it, affordances could not be coordinated, remembered, or acted upon. The ecological view instead proposes that the brain continually attunes itself to the organism's interaction with its environment rather than constructing perception independently of it. Knowledge, therefore, arises from the organism-environment system rather than the brain considered in isolation. 2. Perception requires active exploration. The supercomputer thought experiment assumes that perception can be reduced to a complete collection of sensory inputs presented to a computational system. Implicitly, this assumes that perceptual information exists as a fixed data set that can be supplied independently of the organism's behavior. This assumption corresponds closely to what Gibson called optical stasis. A fixed sensory dataset necessarily represents only one observational state, one position, one orientation, one direction of gaze, one scale, and one instant in time. In effect, it freezes the world into a single snapshot. Real perception does not occur in this way. Gibson argued that perception depends upon optical flow, the lawful transformation of structured light as an organism moves through its environment. Consider sitting on a moving train. Grass immediately beside the tracks appears to rush past, trees farther away move more slowly, and mountains on the horizon appear almost stationary. Likewise, when viewed from an aircraft, the apparent movement of the ground decreases dramatically as altitude increases. These changing speed gradients are not distortions added by the brain. They are information specifying the organism's movement relative to the environment. Every movement of the organism changes the available information. Turning the head, crouching, walking around an object, changing one's height, or simply shifting one's gaze reveals new surfaces, new edges, new texture gradients, and previously hidden spatial relationships. This is where the distinction between invariance and variance becomes crucial. An invariant is a stable relation that remains constant across changing conditions. In ecological perception, invariants are the enduring structures in the environment that persist despite movement, such as the layout of a surface, the relation between an object and its background, or the lawful pattern that specifies a particular affordance. A variance is a change that occurs within or across those stable relations. Variances are the differences in speed, angle, size, texture, position, and perspective that arise as the organism moves. They are not noise to be ignored. They are what make invariance detectable in the first place. In other words, variance reveals change against a background of invariance. A single fixed image cannot do this. It freezes the moving flow of the environment into one static arrangement, which means it removes the very differences through which invariants become perceptible. If the world is presented as a single unchanging data set, then the organism cannot tell what remains stable across movement and what changes as a result of movement. It cannot determine whether a pattern is relevant for action or merely incidental to one momentary viewpoint. Without variance, invariance cannot be perceived. The environment is therefore not supplying a finished image waiting to be processed. Instead, information is continually disclosed through exploration. This presents a fundamental difficulty for the supercomputer analogy. If perception depends upon an organism's future actions, then no fixed dataset can ever be complete. The computer cannot simply be supplied with all sensory information because the relevant information has not yet been specified. It depends upon what the organism subsequently chooses to do. To overcome this, the computer would need to anticipate every possible future movement the organism could make and generate the corresponding environmental information before those movements occurred. Yet these future actions cannot themselves be predicted independently because they are continually guided by the very information currently being perceived. Action changes perception, while perception simultaneously guides action. The two form a continuous reciprocal loop. The supercomputer, therefore, does not merely lack sufficient information. It begins from the mistaken assumption that perceptual information exists as a complete dataset independently of the organism's active exploration. 3. Perceptual information has no fixed resolution. The computational picture also assumes that perception consists of fixed informational units that can simply be transmitted to a processor. Ecological psychology offers a very different picture. Imagine looking through a peephole into what appears to be a perfectly ordinary three-dimensional room. In reality, the room is merely a carefully painted illusion. While remaining perfectly still, the pattern of light reaching the eye is sufficient to sustain the illusion of depth. However, moving one's head only slightly immediately destroys the illusion. A genuine three-dimensional room would reveal new surfaces, changing perspectives, hidden edges, and lawful transformations of texture. A flat painting cannot. This demonstrates that perception depends not upon isolated images but upon the lawful changes in information produced through movement. More fundamentally, the environment possesses no fixed informational resolution. Moving closer to a rock reveals pebbles. Examining a pebble reveals grains of sand. Magnifying those grains reveals microscopic textures. Greater magnification reveals cellular, molecular, and atomic structure. At no obvious point does the environment cease revealing further organization. Perceptual information is therefore indefinitely nested. At each scale, new invariants and variances become available. What appears stable at one level may reveal change at another, and what appears variable at one level may reveal stability at another. The environment does not consist of finite perceptual pixels waiting to be sampled. New information continually becomes available depending upon the scale at which the organism interacts with the world and the actions it performs. Consequently, no finite database of perceptual units can completely specify an environment independently of exploration. 4. Light reveals rather than creates information. Finally, the supercomputer thought experiment misunderstands the role of light. Light is often treated as though it were itself the information being processed by the brain. Gibson argued otherwise. Light functions as a medium that structures and carries information already present within the environment. We do not perceive light itself. Rather, we perceive environmental structures specified through lawful patterns of reflected light reaching the retina. These structured patterns continuously change as the organism moves relative to surrounding surfaces. The organization of Moreover, the organization of light depends upon physical processes governed by thermodynamics. Energy is reflected, absorbed, scattered, and conserved according to lawful constraints that shape the information available to perception. A computational system cannot simply receive an exhaustive collection of light rays detached from an observer because the informational significance of light exists only relative to an organism situated within a particular environment and actively interacting with it. The retina receives structured light, but the information carried by that light exists because of the lawful relationship between energy, environment, and organism, not because it has first been constructed inside the brain. Conclusion. The supercomputer thought experiment assumes that perception consists of processing a complete collection of sensory inputs inside an isolated computational system. Ecological psychology rejects this assumption. Knowledge is not generated by the brain alone, but emerges from the continuous coupling between organism and environment. Affordances are relational rather than intrinsic. Perception depends upon active exploration rather than passive reception. Information is not supplied as a complete dataset, but continually disclosed through movement. Moreover, the environment possesses no fixed informational resolution that could simply be encoded into a finite computational representation. If this ecological account is correct, then the supercomputer thought experiment does not merely underestimate computational complexity, it misunderstands what perception is. Perception is not the internal processing of static information, but the ongoing lawful interaction between an organism and the world it inhabits.